Hi, my name is Mandy, and first and foremost, I want to thank my friend and chosen family member, Dr. David and Gwenny, for inviting me to this platform. Today, I want to share some of my learnings and stories about healing from white supremacy. Here's part one. Who are your people? Ella Jo Baker was a brilliant civil and human rights organizer for more than 5 decades. When meeting people, she was fond of asking the question, who are your people? She meant, where do you come from, but also, who do you identify with? I want to start with this question because when it was first shared with me a couple years ago, I honestly didn't know how to answer. I didn't really remember which jumble of European countries my ancestors came from. I didn't feel connected to Methodism, which my mom practices, and didn't really know if I should claim my father's Jewish identity, religiously or culturally. I didn't want to claim my whiteness. In fact, I was actively judgmental of other white people. I didn't feel especially proud of my hometown, a wealthy white central New Jersey town a couple miles up the road from Trenton, but more like a world away from it. I'm queer and polyamorous, but those words can sometimes cause a reaction that makes me feel more isolated than connected. Everything else felt trivial. I'm a bread baker, a gardener, a vegan, someone who loves birds and most everything in the natural world. James Baldwin said the following: "One of the things that most afflicts this country is that white people don't know who they are, where they come from, and that's why you think I'm a problem. But I am not the problem. Your history is. And as long as you pretend that you don't know your history, you're going to be the prisoner of it." In the pursuit of being able to answer Ella Baker's question, I spent some time investigating my ancestors and myself. I learned that I come from a French cabinet maker, a German wagon maker, and a carpenter, who somehow acquired, married into, or were born onto family farms in settler communities in Wisconsin. I know of at least one ancestor living in Chicago who served in the Civil War for the Union. There are stories of survivors of shipwrecks in Haiti and a family member lost to yellow fever while making the voyage. They had the means to hire domestic and farm workers, and then during World War II, their land was worked by German war prisoners. One of them saved the state's cabbage crop one year and had a local school named after him. They were able to talk their way out of bootlegging and train hopping after being caught by the police. My grandmother grew up very fast when her brother died in the war and her mother passed shortly after. I also come from a Norwegian and Englishman whose stories of emigration are lost. I come from a fire truck driver and women who hosted boarders. During the Depression, one of my grandfather's parents couldn't afford to keep him fed and sent him away to his aunt's home. I'm the descendant of Russian and Ukrainian Jews fleeing persecution in the late 1800s. One line of these Jewish ancestors' last name was lost, either due to error or assimilation. I come from Polish Jews who were prominent fur traders in Europe. Extended family members were among those murdered in the Holocaust, including at Auschwitz. I come from a pajama manufacturer, real estate investor, furniture wholesaler, and an event planner who all settled and thrived among their family and their Jewish and Eastern European communities in Philadelphia. All of my grandparents went to college and were the first generation to do so, and both grandfathers served in World War II. I come from people who loved to collect things: rocks, dishware, cars, political memorabilia, tools, antiques. I'm the descendant of journalists, salesmen, cancer survivors, people who struggled with addiction and mental health battles, and people committed to charitable and service work. I have ancestors who were in the United States as slavery reached its peak, with nearly 4 million people enslaved. Perhaps some of them had witnessed slave trading during stopovers in the Caribbean and the American South in the 1830s and 40s. I have ancestors who were in the United States as the country was completing the final displacement of American Indian people onto reservations, and beginning to send their children to schools intended to erase their cultural traditions. The first ancestors of mine arriving to the United States lived on the stolen, unceded land of the Kickapoo, Peoria, Kaskaskia, Miamia, Oceti-Sakowee, Potawatomi, Sauk and Meskwaki, Winnebago, and Lenni Lenape. I have ancestors who wouldn't have been considered white until the end of World War II, as Jews also became middle class. Their neighborhoods in Philadelphia were redlined and disinvested as they also became majority Black. The GI Bill, arguably the most massive affirmative action program in US history, offered college and very cheap home mortgages to my grandfathers. James Baldwin also offered the following. White means that you are European still, and Black means that I'm African. And we both know we've both been here too long. You can't go back to Ireland or Poland or England, and I can't go back to Africa. We will live here together, or we will die here together. My family has very, very few cultural traditions from my European ancestors that persisted into my lifetime. I do not feel connected to France, Germany, Poland, Norway, England, Russia, or Ukraine. And yet, this exploration has helped me begin to answer Ella Baker's question and James Baldwin's call for accountability. I will assume complexity in the lives of my ancestors, as I would wish anyone to assume complexity about my life. Looking at what I know about my ancestors, I see moments of poverty and discrimination that could have linked our lives to larger struggles. Perhaps my ancestors would be dancing for joy that me and many in my generation are actively pursuing anti-racist and anti-capitalist futures. Nonetheless, the family has histories that I intend to reckon with are those of race and class privilege, the disproportionate ability to build generational wealth that makes me upper class today, and the cycles of remaining comfortable in our positions of power and opportunity. Okay, here's part 2, healing from white supremacy. There's something I need to remind myself again and again. Everyone raised in the United States is raised within racist and oppressive systems. I don't believe that anyone is inherently bad, including white people, but all people have racism reinforced into us, whether external or internalized racism, simply by living in the United States. We are born into systems much larger than us, a toxic culture of whiteness that conditions us. However, we're not powerless. We can and must intentionally walk ourselves away from that socialization. It is vulnerable to confront and admit to the lies we have believed, that white people are somehow superior to others. It is safer and more emotionally secure to take ourselves to be innocent. However, white supremacy doesn't only cause hell for Black folks. As Princeton professor Eddie Glaude points out, quote, "It is literally deforming and disfiguring the character of the people who embrace it," unquote. If we aren't confronting the lies we were taught, we adjust ourselves to injustice. The place where I grew up, Hopewell Valley in central New Jersey, is largely a place of abundance. Preserved green space, a top-ranked school district, and a median income of about $135,000. I was instilled with the belief that Hopewell is a progressive community that lives out the values of open-mindedness and open arms to the diversity of the world around us. I saw the problems of the world happening elsewhere, down the road in Trenton or across the global South in so-called developing countries. In reality, my hometown has been a place of violence, direct and structural. A neighbor in my hometown, Renata Barnes, recently wrote the following. In truth, our own Sourland Mountains are soaked in the tears, sweat, and hopes of first-generation slaves as their descendants drive the roads that began as trails beaten back by their ancestors. In my lifetime, I went to schools and lived in a neighborhood that was deeply segregated from the majority Black and Latinx state capital of Trenton, just a few miles down the road. One of the things that I learned growing up was a white savior complex. I was very subscribed to the idea that I needed to help or fix Black communities near and far. My first significant experience within a community of color was traveling to Kenya as a 15-year-old with my biology teacher, Dr. Ngweni, who took us around the country and to his own hometown. I romanticized the ways of life I observed in Kenya. Perhaps I was craving the aspects of Kenyan cultures that white culture did not provide me. But simultaneously, I came home and set upon essentially making decisions about what is best for other people. What food to buy for distributions in Trenton, for example, or what projects to fundraise for in rural Kenya. Flash forward to my first job after college, and I found myself having a quarter-life crisis, feeling like my job at a mainstream environmental organization was completely unfulfilling. But I couldn't quite put my finger on why this seemingly mission-driven place was so disappointing, and why I felt such guilt about how I spent my days. I had a huge awakening when I first read The Characteristics of White Supremacy Culture, the analysis of Kenneth Jones and Tema Okin. I could apply every single characteristic to my workplace. Paternalism, perfectionism, urgency, individualism, objectivity, fear of open conflict, defensiveness, a preference for quantity over quality, believing in only one right way to do things, trying to simplify complex things, hoarding power, and expecting a right to comfort. I also realized that this culture was one that I knew deeply and had perpetuated throughout my own life. I've been learning that guilt and shame can be important for mobilizing people with privilege, but they can also become toxic if we sit in them. It does not serve anyone to allow these feelings to drive you to anxiety and depression that is debilitating. It does not serve anyone to allow these feelings to drive you to anger and hostility, or self-righteousness and elitism toward the people you love. For people like me, people with race and class privilege, to be in solidarity with people unlike myself and to be able to successfully call in other people with privilege to hard conversations, I believe we have to heal from our own pain from internalized white supremacy. I'm still learning how to pursue healing, but here's what it's looked like for me so far. In one instance where I caused harm to a Black housemate, she called in 2 healers to facilitate a dialogue. Though we didn't heal our relationship, in large part because of my own guilt and shame that I trapped myself in, these healers were essential to reframing my thinking. Later, Sandra Kim, founder of Everyday Feminism and Rebecoming Human, helped me understand my own need to build emotional capacity to understand the realities of white supremacy and how it dehumanizes white people, to reconnect with myself, reconnect with my lineages, and reconnect with nature. I found I needed therapy and medication. Over time, I began practicing getting more rooted in my body, using breathing and meditative exercises, getting outside to walk every day, and dancing with my partner. I have found communities for healing conversations with other white people with wealth and class privilege, and other white people in my neighborhood. I found healing in redistributing the excess wealth and income that I do not need. I've slowly been reconnecting with my Jewish identity through holidays, events hosted by a wonderful local group, and being in community with my partner and another Jewish housemate. I have the honor to work at one of the oldest and largest civil rights organizations in the country, to organize with brilliant neighbors who are defending public housing and supporting mutual aid during the pandemic, and to live in a multiracial and cross-class intentional community of artists and activists. To show up in these spaces as a white person means constant self-reflection and accountability. I think about Ella Baker's wisdom for how I participate in the movement for collective liberation. She, quote, pushed college students to see illiterate sharecroppers as their people, their allies, and their political mentors. She pushed Northerners to embrace Southerners in principled solidarity. She organized back and forth across various color and cultural lines and across generational divides, unquote. Solidarity means finding my own stake in racial justice. And slowly, I think I'm getting there. Along the way, I'm finding that who I consider my people is growing and growing, and I'm feeling more and more myself. Thank you.